Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm here with my co host, Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, mate?
I always say excited, but I'm kind of especially excited. I have one of my research heroes with us today, Dave Vago, which I'm so excited to be talking with. So I'm great. Let's get started.
Yeah, so as preempted, today we are lucky enough to welcome Dr. David Vago. Dave is an associate professor of psychology at Vanderbilt University, a research associate at Harvard Medical School, and a serial meditator. He held the position of Senior Research Coordinator for the Mind and Life Institute and is currently a Mind and Life Fellow. Dave, how are you, mate?
Oh, doing wonderful. Excited also to be here. I'm really glad I can be part of the dialogue that you guys are creating.
Well, we're happy to have you, and there's a fair bit to get through, as you might imagine. But something I wanted to start with, because we haven't spoken about it, if memory serves, before, and you speak about it so beautifully, is meta awareness.
Hmm.
This is if you say meta awareness to someone without any context, they think you're about to overcomplicate things. But everyone has this. So, what is meta awareness?
Yeah, it's a great question. Why don't we just start with the simplest answer, and then we can unpack it. The simplest answer would be, as my teacher Minja Rinpoche would say, awareness of awareness. So what does that really mean, awareness of awareness? There's a lot of times the word meta-awareness gets conflated with metacognition, which, if you really get granular about this, then metacognition is thinking about your own thoughts.
Right.
Where you can have thoughts about okay, reflection, evaluation, interpretation of your own judgment. Sometimes it's referred to as internally directed cognition. Actually writing a nice commentary on that right now. But the idea there is that it's thought driven, it's conceptual, very conceptual, or propositional even. And meta awareness really refers to more of a non-conceptual or non-propositional aspect of maintaining awareness of where your mind may be at any moment. So I would say it's a higher ordered form of conscious thinking that doesn't involve the conceptual part of thinking. So there's just a level of awareness that's ambient in nature. And we can get into this because we have models for how this works. But if I may, I could just dive right in, and start with this neurobiological framework that we created for mindfulness. And the idea is, if you take mindfulness as a systematic method for either improving our ability to gain more awareness of our insights and our habits, mental habits, for regulating our emotions and attention, and for transcending the self, for really sort of cultivating more pro-social characteristics, more constructive types of emotional experiences like compassion, empathy, theory of mind. That kind of systematic process is all dependent on the ability to have this idea, this ability, this capacity of meta-awareness. And in the framework that we created, we use the term SART framework: self-awareness, self-regulation, self-transcendence. In it, we go into depth on how meditation practices train these different cognitive processes across the brain, from intentionality and motivation to executive functioning, focused attention, working memory, how the attentional system can help train alerting, orienting, and engagement of our attention on objects, the ability to distance ourselves from distracting types of thoughts or objects that may arise in our awareness. And then from that kind of decentering process, or what we call psychological distancing or decentering, then that's where meta-awareness starts to get into a sort of a valuable process for understanding where our mind is. So if the goal is to focus our attention on an object like the breath, if we're taking a meditation practice like breath awareness practice as an example, the goal is to set your intention, which is, I'm going to sit in meditation and focus on my breath. Here's my intention. Now you have this set of instructions that takes a lot of executive functioning. So you have to hold that set of instructions in mind, and you're focusing your attention on that object, which is your breath. It requires working memory. So once you get into that loop and you're able to engage on an object, how do you sustain your attention on that object without losing awareness that you are there, and without getting lost in distraction? And then lastly, if you do get distracted, which is normal, everyone does, how do you then get back to where you were supposed to be? Going back to your original intention, I'm going to focus on my breath. So meta-awareness is key in all of that process, all those processes, to see it as like in the most fundamental way, you can say that it's the old homunculus argument that sort of helps us understand what we mean by meta-awareness. Who is doing the watching, right? It's the watcher that's inside of our bodies, our minds, our brains, that is able to observe the processes that are happening not only inside our mind as we think and do, but what's happening around us. And not only have that insight into what's happening around us and inside of us, but how do we relate to those things? How do we switch between the different objects of attention or the things that are competing for our attention, and stay focused, right? Because we can get distracted and start to think about, things that happened yesterday, maybe sounds that are happening around us. And in fact, there are disordered systems of consciousness like schizophrenia, where there's an inability to even distinguish between what is real or what is imagined. And so meta-awareness becomes a critical functioning by which humans, and humans alone, can actually maintain that level of monitoring between all the processes and direct the switching between internal focus or external focus of attention.
Wow, it's so in a way, meta-awareness turns out to be kind of hero here. Like attention training is good, but it sounds to me like attention training is one of the ways that you can start cultivating these higher level meta-awareness styles, and they seem like are they more beneficial? And then the second sort of question is like, how do you train this? Now that we've sort of got a model that meta-awareness is doing something really important, awareness of what you're being aware of ends up being crucial. Is there any special pointing out for developing those skills or abilities?
Yeah, so if we continue to sort of unpack this whole idea of metacognition and meta-awareness, so sort of the idea of having this sort of secondary interpretation of our experience, right? So there's the thought-based or propositional form of perspective taking, or a witness consciousness, and then there's the non-propositional or non-conceptual awareness, which doesn't sort of grasp onto any sort of object. It does require training.
Can you say that again? Say that again, because I was surprised there. So you said witness. You're counting witness as a kind of metacognition, not meta-awareness. Is that right?
No, I would put the witness into a meta-awareness framework. Yeah. So I don't want to conflate the two concepts too much, but people do often do. So I thought I'd bring both of them into the discussion. But really, metacognitive knowledge of general facts about how the mind works that arises when attention is directed towards explicitly noting the current contents of consciousness. That's the way people like Jonathan Schooler and Johnny Smallwood, they often talk about metacognition. It's very intermittent, but they're often described as fluctuating, with mind wandering, or what's also referred to as stimulus independent thought. And the key is what happens with or without explicit knowledge that the mind has wandered, right? So you can have a thought that you're just, during a passive state of relaxation, and you can have awareness that you had the thought, or you can just be totally zoned out where you don't even realize you had the thought.
Yeah.
And then there's this this distinction between the propositional and non-propositional form of it. The non, or sort of the metacognitive monitoring is conceptual tracking. It's knowing that you're doing something. This is a sort of a judgment related to the content of your experience, that I am not paying attention right now. So that's a serious way to think of that thing. Yeah. So that's metacognition.
And meta-awareness is different than this.
Yes. So meta-awareness is really, is a form of again non-conceptuality. It is also involves some sort of intermittent state that fluctuates, but there's an element that doesn't grasp onto any object with the typical stickiness or engagement that you happen to have with a when you have cognition with it, right? So there is one way that's described actually by John Donne, who's a Buddhist scholar. He really focuses on this non-propositional component of it as a form of more procedural monitoring. So monitoring meaning that you have your typical processes of the self, right? So we break down an experience by moment-to-moment processes, right? And moment-to-moment processes can also have a temporal dimension to it.
Sure.
Meaning you have an object that comes into mind, or it's in the world around you, and you either have a perception, which happens between your motor and sensory experience. So something comes up through your spinal cord in terms of the sensory world, and you then have some level of awareness of it, that I just saw something, right? So here's a mug that comes into view, and I see the mug. And so before you even have awareness of it, there is certainly processes that are happening in your eye from the actual visual stimulus. It goes to your retina and then goes back to the visual cortex. And that process can happen within 15 milliseconds. It's very quick, right? And even at the level of this non-conscious process, you can have the brain is doing things that you don't have any awareness of, but it's modulated by emotional value and relevance to yourself.
Sure.
And then only at about 250 to 300 milliseconds do you then have actual awareness that you saw something. I saw a mug. And if you look at Benjamin Libet's work, physiologist from many decades ago now, he was basically trying to experiment with the timing of sensory experience and awareness. And what he basically concluded was that our awareness is always about 500 milliseconds behind where the experience truly was. So everything that we experience in awareness is really just a construction of what happened in the past. That's an important part. So our awareness then just becomes some perspective that we put around the sensory onslaught of information that comes into our bodies and brains, and it's a part of our experience that's very momentary. It's in an actual immediate sensation of I saw something, and then after that, and only after that, do we start to have the more cognitive component, which is evaluative, and that happens around 300 to 500 milliseconds in that moment that you just saw a mug. So you see a mug, and only at the point that you saw the mug, already 250 milliseconds of process has already happened in your brain and body. And then only after about 300 milliseconds, you start to realize, it's a mug. It looks like a certain type of mug. It's red and white and blah, blah, blah. It has different meaning behind it. You put meaning behind it. Now, that all happens in 500 milliseconds, right? The meta-awareness, the idea of meta-awareness is that it sort of frames the entire experience of perception, awareness, and evaluation, is that it's overarching across all those different processes. And it starts to get deeper into the non-conscious process, although it is most prevalent in the experience with awareness and evaluation. So
So
you're
this ongoing awareness is letting you get back earlier and earlier processing stages so that you can
That's
see
the
the
idea.
things for what they are rather than being sort of conceptually elaborated. You're starting to see some of the machinery.
Exactly. So the non-conceptual, non-propositional form of awareness is second order. It's embodied. So it is really situated into where you are in your experience. It's a reflection on the experience itself as a form of experience itself. And it's not entangled in the contents of awareness like cognition is. So cognition is entangled in the sense that it's sticky, it takes up resources, it can interfere with other demands on your attention, whereas a meta-awareness will not be entangled in that same conceptual kind of processing load that cognition requires.
The idea that increasing your abilities in that way allows the processing to happen quicker, or rather the evaluation can happen quicker. It's almost Matrix-esque, right? Like
Yeah.
you're seeing things as they happen. And
Experience how they happen. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
it's funny, like I watch a fair bit of cricket, and when someone's playing well, you might describe they're seeing the ball as a beach ball. It's just so big, right? They just see it early, and the processing as soon as the ball's out the hand, they've tracked it, and it sounds
Great
like
example.
it's a similar function here.
Oh man, it's a great example. In fact, I use that. I don't always use cricket. I use baseball. But if you imagine the time it takes for a pitcher to throw a baseball 90 feet from a pitcher's mound, and for a batter to connect with the ball that's going 90 miles per hour, it actually translates. So it takes about something like 25 milliseconds for you only have about 20. The batter only has about 25 milliseconds to make the decision of whether to swing or not. There's not much conscious evaluation or thinking going on. The body has learned
It's all
over time.
brainstem. It's all brainstem reactive. It's all spine reactivity.
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily all brain stem, but that would be the typical. So this goes into this idea of that this triune brain theory, that there's the limbic brain or the reptilian brain that sort of is more automatic. But in fact, we're seeing even at 35 milliseconds that any visual stimulus that enters the visual cortex is modulated by emotion. And that means that even in the cortex, there's processes that are happening as early as maybe 20 to 35 milliseconds
Evaluating
that it's somehow
what's it worth to you.
interpreting what to do with
Yeah.
that oncoming stimulus. So when you say that the cricket player is really not thinking or sees it in large or dilates the experience, it really is a dilation of access to what's happening at that non-conscious level, right? You're getting more access.
But you know what's interesting too is like I've never had that experience in cricket, but I've certainly had experiences where I feel like because of my level of concentration or my level of being in flow or something to do with my perception, I am anticipating things faster and I'm clearer on where a ball is going to land, or I'm playing chess better. Now, I'm just trying to understand what role, if any, metacognitive awareness has when it comes to flow states and our ability to be in flow.
Nice.
Yeah, great question. So I usually put flow states into the same category as deep level of concentration also. Typically, you are distraction is less likely. You are very embodied, and there is very little processing power necessary by the brain. You don't have to think about what you're doing in those flow states. You are just doing, right? You could probably take off the whole cortex, or even the entire brain, and still your body is responding to the environment so well that it's so deeply ingrained into not only the neural patterns or the neural circuitry of how you're doing something. Let's just say you're playing cricket, or whatever. Any sort of a musical instrument is maybe another example that I can relate to, where many people can relate to, because when you train to be a musician, you are so you're repeating the same types of skills over and over again, whether you're playing a piano or a wind instrument where you have to move your fingers a lot, and you're responding back and forth with your environment and your brain to lay down very, very clear patterns of sensory stimulus and motor response. And then there, of course, there's levels of arousal and emotion that constrain that system and make it more efficient. But the idea is, just like any memory, the more you practice it, the more automatic it becomes, and the less resources you need from here to even think about doing it, right? So that when you're in the flow state, you're basically practicing doing a skill that your body now knows. When you say body memory or skill-based memory, it's procedural in the sense that you don't have to think about it anymore. So meta-awareness fits in there, yeah, for sure.
Right there though. But how does meta-awareness fit into that? I mean, if it's just procedural habit, because that just sounds like a lower level habitual.
That's true.
Activation, but I do feel like meta awareness here must be part of what's watching for quality control and making sort of fine-tune adjustments, because it has a sort of broader perspective where there's dips away from the flow state or where there's opportunities to once again get back to that edge, something like this.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So let's make that distinction. So the brain automatizes behaviors and motor skills by using the skill-based memory circuits, the basal ganglia. Those are really important for doing skills like riding a bike, right? Everyone can relate to that. When you ride a bike, you're not having to think about balancing anymore, right? You're just riding. But what it does when you activate that circuitry, and by the way, one of the most common circuitries that are active in meditation is the basal ganglia. So the caudate and putamen areas of the brain are very active during meditation. So it's a very automatized process. And what it does is it frees up cognitive resources, meaning that if you're doing any task, and we'll go back to our music analogy here. If we're playing an instrument and you're in the zone, you're totally just, grooving away. You're not thinking. It's because it's activated those automatized circuitry, skill-based circuitry, and now you can just be meta-aware because you don't have to think. If this is a task that requires a lot of processing or cognitive power, it's harder for you to maintain awareness of awareness of where
because attention keeps collapsing awareness. It keeps shining the spotlight too strongly on some particular set.
And it's a great analogy again, because the spotlight and the floodlight, this is something that Michi Jha talks about a lot in terms of her description of attention. It's a great one because when you do that spotlight of attention, you're narrowing the focus so much that you fail to see what's around you. Even meditators. However, what's interesting about there's two really interesting points about focusing attention like a spotlight. One is that you're training your brain. You're training to become very good at sustaining attention, maintaining attention on an object, and not being pulled away by distraction. So that's when the original question was about, how do you train your brain, your mind to gain man awareness? Well, you have to train it first to be able to sustain attention. That's number one.
But the other half must be true too, right? Meta awareness is what allows attention to get more steady because you are aware. Is that not right? Because now you're aware of where distractions are possibly.
Those micro fluctuations of attention that sort of lead you to distraction. If you get lost without knowing where your mind went, then you're off to the races on something else. That's the whole point of always training yourself to bring back from distraction. But that is the process of learning to constrain attention by being aware of the distraction, right?
Got it.
So that's the focus. Now you can go into like the way that the Hindus talk about attention and strong attention is through samadhi, right? Samadhi is a Sanskrit word essentially for single-pointed attention or very strong concentration. And there's the great there's this great description of this the still point of consciousness, where you can hone your concentration to a single point so strong and so narrow that you that's where this non-dual experience starts to then expand. It's what Shinzen Young refers to as the deep contraction that leads to expansion of awareness. And there is something very special about deep concentration that then leads to the opening of awareness. So there's that access to this non-dual state or non-propositional form of awareness through concentration. Or you just start with the other aspect of the floodlight of attention, which is open awareness, where you're open to all things that all objects that are arising and passing in time and space, and you are just monitoring them. And this is the true mindful awareness, right? So you're aware of all objects as they arise and pass, whether they're small objects in your personal space or they're ambient around you. You're noting and labeling them like the Burmese Mahasi Sayadaw tradition trains you to do. Just note and label any object that arises and passes. So that's another way to train your brain and mind to become more meta-aware through this ambient or more floodlight of attention model. That's the open awareness model.
It sounds like the sort of traditional Vedantic and Tantric split here, where one says, get less, get down to a single point. And
Yes.
the other one says, include more, until, both sort of lead to an acceptance of everything in a funny way, but in either by cutting it away or by including more. That's really interesting that attention and awareness might be very similar like that.
Yeah, you could even extend the metaphor to the self, right? So the Atman, right, is the eternal self.
Right.
And of course, it has its constraints of leading to suffering, with all levels of attachment to that experience of self and what your self is, your self-identity, your values, whoever you think you are. This reified self is a static sense of that self through a process of conditioning over time. And so the Buddhists often talk about the non-self as sort of the ultimate, right? So anatman, right? So anatman is, and actually you described very often in Buddhist literature, but in the Hindu Vedanta literature you see anatman quite often, because there is this eternal self that is described, that is beyond the body, beyond the brain, beyond the material. And so I guess the metaphor really is about looking at focus, concentration, and open awareness, and comparing it to the self, and seeing the ultimate through a focus, concentration versus a non-self, which would be something much more open awareness and Buddhist space. Yeah.
This might not go anywhere, but I just want to say it because I think it's great, and this is a cool part of our conversation. But I think it was Ajahn Chah, right, who said, of course there's a self. We train like there's no self, but there ends up being a self. But it's not a self like you would expect. It's kind of cool, right? Even in a tradition where you say no self, you sort of wash up onto a very interesting experience of self, but it's nothing like the self you were expecting.
Yeah, I think our understanding of the self as a construct and how we better understand it and where it can be localized is critical to this conversation of meta-awareness. There's Buddhist scholars like Evan Thompson who often are very critical of neuroscience for trying to assume that we can find self or even a non-propositional experience in the brain, right? So many of the embodied cognitive scientists or inactive philosophers talk about this aspect of consciousness or phenomenological experience as not within the brain, here. It's not going to be found here like we try to say, motor tapping or bicycle riding that we just use that as some sort of experience that's automatized, that's skill based. You could say that whenever the circuitry in the brain is active for riding a bike, you'll know that you're riding a bike because you just have to look at the brain and say, there it is. That person must be riding a bike because it's activating motor circuitry. The same with, they used to have a part in the brain called the fusiform gyrus that was referred to as the face area. And in fact, it went down to the cellular level and said, here's a grandmother cell, because there's a cell that will, cells within that fusiform face area will light up whenever you see your grandmother. But it's not as simple as that, as we've learned over time.
Yeah.
That, of course,
localization's going out the window quickly.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So that's an old model, but now when the more we interact with Buddhist philosophers and scholars, and realize that, well, consciousness and the self may not be in here in the brain or the body. It's sort of, it's our relationship to the rest of the world around us that matters. So of course there are correlates that I think you can point to and say, this part of the brain is responsible for non-propositional forms of awareness, but the experience, the phenomenology, is very much out here in how we relate to the environment.
How do you study that? I mean, you must. I mean, this is where you run into a real challenge, right? Because we can look at the brain and we can look at the nervous system. It's challenging to look at brain-body environment dynamics, isn't it? Because you can't do it in an MRI. MRI, you necessarily pull the person out of their niche, stick them in a machine, make a bunch of big noises, and then make some conclusions about what we find. So, yeah, how do we? Is there? I mean, maybe we don't have an answer to this, but what do you think about it?
Well, you know, that's it's been some of my really great interest in this idea of mapping the meditative mind in this project, is looking at advanced meditators as they move through these states. So if we're able to say that you can move through states of awareness that go deeper and deeper into this, either deeper states of concentration or into non-dual states of awareness where there is no subject-object duality, if that is truly an experience that can be repeated across different traditions, even across different types of practice, then we should be able to measure some aspect of correlation between that state, the phenomenology, and what's happening in the brain or the body, or in the place around, in the space around us. Now, we don't have good tools for measuring energy around us. They've done work like, they've looked at auras, and you can look at electromagnetic energy around a person, but it's not often used, certainly not in clinical practice. Though if you look at EEG, which is a very common method to use, we have looked at different microstates, wavelet theory, time frequency analyses. There are different ways to subtly get at the phenomenology that's reported, and then look at these correlates of electrical activity that's happening that you can measure on the scalp. And what we have seen, for example, with some of these Dzogchen practices of open awareness, there's some work that was, one teacher named Dan Brown, who passed away recently, he had a particular style of Dzogchen practice that he taught, which is called pointing out the way. And it moves through different states of awareness. And we were able to measure in EEG, moving from the first sort of baseline state of ground or awareness into a deeper non-dual state that has a very specific phenomenology behind it, that's more oceanic in quality. There's ways to describe it, but if you read any of the literature on, say, psychedelics, or non-dual states of awareness, there's a non-dual state of awareness scale that was developed by Eric Garland and Adam Hanley. There is a bunch of different transcendent states of awareness models now, and they all describe very similar phenomenology. So whether it's psychedelics or whether it's meditation, or whether you're just maybe in the zone playing cricket, that experience of sort of vastless vastness or spaciousness is very similar. And we can map those states. And you do see correlates. I mean, there are, for example, the midline structures, you'll see a particular type of frequency called theta. And that is one of the most common substrates now found as an indicator of deep states of concentration, midline theta. And there's lots of data on this now too, but is it really the correlate of non-dual states of awareness? Probably not. And then there's gamma band, which is greater than 60 hertz. And if you can measure that, that usually refers to sort of a gestalt of an experience or very synchronized activity that reflects just highly coordinated synthesis of information. And people, there's been some good studies to show that advanced practitioners practicing non-referential compassion, a non-dual state of awareness with compassion sentiment behind it, have this gamma band activity globally across their brain. So there are these correlates that we've found, and if you move across the states of awareness through, like, say, Dan Brown's method, we've showed that you can change not only the frequency states, but amplitude, magnitude of activity happens dramatically. So there are these correlates that we can point to. And I think we're doing a pretty good job of mapping them, but we are limited by our technology. And I do think that as we get more into this sort of inactive embodied approach that's not just in the brain, but outside, that we can start looking at things like, some people look at these resonant frequencies. Now, I don't know, there's not a lot of science in this, but I'm just going to mention it. That there's solfeggio frequencies that are apparently sacred and are in the range of like hundreds of, I think they go from, I don't know exactly, but they're very high frequency. They're sounds that you can certainly measure. Something between like there's one in particular that you see in YouTube a lot, 528 hertz. Right, and there's a whole number of these that match the chakras, and there's not a lot of science behind it. But if we start to measure global frequency activity, that could also, global could mean in an environment that's like around us with multiple people, in communities or countries or organizations or even the world. You can start to look at these global frequency dynamics that could
Spooky.
be. Yeah, right? So I'll say one other thing about this. There's a guy named Schumann. There's a thing called the Schumann resonance, which is apparently the heartbeat of the Earth, which is extremely low frequency. It's about theta frequency, 7.8 hertz. Very interesting that it's a very similar frequency to the one I pointed to, midline theta, as being important for concentration and being in the zone, in the flow state. So the Earth apparently has this resonance at that same frequency that's generated and excited by lightning discharges, and on the Earth's surface, between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. And this physicist, Winfried Otto Schumann, predicted this mathematically in the 50s. So there is some people interested in this. Some of it may be pseudoscience, but in other terms, I think, it's an interesting place to look outside of our brains to see if of our awareness, contributes to something beyond our own ego and self and into more of this inactive kind of approach of how we interact with the world.
Well, I don't know if it's linked to that particular, like, quote-unquote pseudoscience or not, but why does it feel so good? Like, when we're talking about these states, is there an answer on the level of the brain why it feels good to be in the flow? Because, in a meditation context, you might talk about waves of pleasure, or you might, when you're surfing, it's life-affirming, or you're playing baseball and you're just there. And the interesting thing is people talk about, like, the natural state, and they reference awareness, the resting natural state feeling good. And I was wondering why that might be.
It's a great question. I really want that question to be emphasized, because I don't think we have a good answer for why. I mean, we can certainly point to, yes, of course, when you're in those states, you'll have activation of the reward circuitry. But why is it so joyous? I can't say for sure, but it is the ultimate, right? If when you're in that ultimate state of non-dual awareness, thinking for us as humans is one of the best and worst things that has evolved for us as humans, right? I mean, we are really good at thinking of the worst case scenarios of our lives. We spend so long. I mean, there's this great study by Matt Killingsworth and Dan Gilbert that showed that we spend about 47% of our life mind wandering, and the majority of time that we're mind wandering, it's self-reflecting on something negative in our lives and causally linked to our unhappiness. So if half of our lives is spent thinking about all the bad things that may happen, that happened in the past, or that may happen in the future, then thinking is clearly not the best thing for us to do to feel pleasure. But of course, there are good instances of thinking that can be very pleasurable, right? But and in our imagination and incubating creative ideas, that's all positive and pleasurable. But when we're not thinking, we can just escape all the thinking and be in that moment of awareness. It is quite joyful, right?
Do you associate a spiritual significance to that? Because I know quite often the point that's made is, well, look, it feels really nice not to think. The thinking feels kind of superimposed over the top, and therefore there's something spiritually significant about the absence of thinking.
Nice.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. It's a great point too. I would say if you think about the experience of non-duality, or just being in non-propositional or non-conceptual awareness, there is an experience of unity, experience of oneness, right? It's the ultimate experience to feel connected to everything, right? That experience of, I've now recently moved to British Columbia, and behind me is like these beautiful mountains and nature, and I connect with that just like most people do, with this aspect of awe, right? When you're in something in the natural environment and it causes you to feel awe, that awe is the same experience that we're talking about, this non-dual sort of flow state of awareness. You can get it when you're playing sports or you're playing music or meditating or just surrounded by nature. You feel connected to nature. It's a strong feeling that you get. And that experience of awe also is fueled by something that's out there in the world, the energy that you feel. When you're in a small, let's just say you're in an elevator with listening to horrible, elevator music and surrounded by people that you don't like. That doesn't feel good, right? But when you're around something more expansive and full of nature and nature's beauty, then you're going to have that natural state of awe and wonderment, and feeling of positive endorphins will be associated with that.
There's something universal about that experience too. I mean, Mark, I remember this is now 2017, you telling a story on a Friday night in a meditation context of some evening you'd had. I can't remember the context exactly in your life, but some evening you'd had growing up, and you had an awesome social experience of some kind, and you came back into your kitchen, and you just thought, oh my God, like, had this moment of connection or moment of flow or moment of something. And I remember hearing that going, God, that sounds almost like the religious experiences I've heard others describe and experiences I've had. And further to the question around the spiritual significance, why is it that this is such a cross-cultural, cross-contextual human thing that you see pop up all over the place and has been integrated into philosophy and literature and music, like America 2022, but Mexico 1300?
Was that a question for me? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought Mark were going to answer that one. Why can we feel that way? I think it has a lot to do with the connection. We all want to be seen and heard. I mean, what is the greatest thing that we have in our lives is our relationships to others. I often say that the whole point of meditating is not to sit on a cushion with your eyes closed in a corner of your house. That the point is to connect with others.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's the
yeah,
point. And to
yeah,
feel someone is actually caring and listening to you and caring for you and loving you, love is the answer. I mean, we all know that love and kindness is what we're seeking.
yeah,
It's just sometimes hard to, um, society's cultural constraints, they prevent us from really connecting with each other, right? When you walk down the road and somebody passes by you, walks right by you, it's another human being. And you often have this like inability or anxiety that doesn't allow you to just look at them in the eye and say hi, recognize, or at least just awareness, just recognizing and connecting with another human being. Just because there's these cultural constraints of putting up walls around us to make sure that we feel safe, because trust can be broken easily. And then, we're like lower on the social ladder and have less status. So status becomes a big thing in these dynamics. Virtue signaling is a huge part of our culture now of likes and how many followers we have. And so our value, our self-worth becomes dependent on some extrinsic motivation or some external value, right? So instead of just finding it within and seeking the connection like we should as humans, we're always looking for some external validation of our worth. And so the most common thought in depression, I'm being in a neuropsychiatric context at at Harvard Medical School, I was surrounded by every possible psychopathology, from schizophrenia to borderline personality disorder, to just good old generalized anxiety. And the single most common thought that people have, this sort of these core beliefs that people have, that Aaron Beck, who's the father of the behavioral forms of therapy, says is, I'm not good enough. I am not good enough is such a strong core belief, because we're always comparing ourselves to others in some way, that we're self-deprecating, and we're driven so much by external validation that we don't just believe in ourselves as whoever we are, whoever we show up to be in any environment. We can just be ourselves, and that's enough. But it never seems like it is when we're trying to perform, and compete with the people around us. So, yeah, I think to make, I think I'm getting at your answer, Jamie. I'm not sure, but
isn't there sort of a way to tie this back? Isn't there something about meta awareness there again? I mean, the discursive mind can be better or worse. It can be good thoughts or bad thoughts, but there is a kind of holism that comes when we're capable of being just aware of all the states as they arise and pass. And it's neither better nor worse. It just is itself. It is just aware.
yes,
It's aware of things. It's ever welcoming in a way, which really is
yeah,
quite close to being love in a way, because it's ever
yeah,
welcoming. It's ever inclusive. It's ever accepting. But if we don't have, like you say, that's a higher level of cognition or awareness that gets, I mean, we must have it naturally as part of our cognitive set, but maybe we underdevelop it. But once it is developed, then maybe we get a chance to transcend some of this better, worse, good, bad, tight, loose, because all of that's acceptable, all of it's understandable and included at some
yeah.
level.
I think that's a great way to tie it back, Mark, because if you start to put a valence on anything, then you start to dissociate the subject and the object, right? Something's good, that means that something's bad, right? If you say something bad, then there's something better. If it's just the feeling of love, the experience of love, right, that is non-dual. So there is something about love that nurtures meta-awareness, in the sense that it's the same non-propositional state, but there's some element of of connection to everything with love or meta awareness. So when I mentioned one of the studies that found the gamma band activity was really strong in meditators and long-term practitioners, that was during a state of non-referential compassion, where there's a wish of freedom of suffering and love for all sentient beings. And that is probably our best model of meta awareness.
Yeah. I would love to see that get strengthened in the research community, that meta awareness, this potentially primordial or foundational form of awareness, either high up in the hierarchy or foundational, I'm not sure exactly how to think of it, is in some ways importantly related to love. That would be such a great research paradigm to like chase down, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure. And you can actually use the model that we talk about from the psychopathology point of view, right? Is this idea of decentering, where you have these basic thoughts, right, of like, I'm not good enough. And meta awareness becomes the ability to disidentify from that internal experience, right? Have a little bit of self-love so you can help, realize it's not me that I'm not good enough, but it's me having a thought, right, that I am not good enough. And that distance, then you create automatically, you have love for yourself, because you're like, I need to have love for myself to realize that it's not me that's not good enough. It's just a thought. Yeah. You disidentify from that thought, which is what's bringing you down. It's causing all the physiological sort of effects on your body, impairments on your body. It's causing the arousal. It's causing the sympathetic arousal that leads to a cascade of inflammatory mechanisms, of stress hormones that are being released, the toxic effects on your organs. All that just comes from a thought, right? So the disidentification from that internal experience, the reduced reactivity to that thought, and our reduced reactivity to the thought is what we mean by not allowing that thought to create that cascade of stress-mediated activation in the body, right? So together, that is actually the model. You can look at Amit Bernstein has also written on this. It's sort of the he calls it the metacognitive process model of decentering. Although I've given him a hard time about using the word metacognitive, in the sense that you have awareness of subjective experience that requires those two components: the disidentification from internal experience and the reduced reactivity to those thoughts. And that decentering process is what we refer to as meta-awareness.
Yeah.
Dave,
where can everybody find you online?
Everywhere. You can find Dave everywhere.
There's a lot of places you can find me. I've been keeping a website up for quite some time called contemplativeneurosciences.com. So that's a good place to find me, my work, and some of the resources that I provide for people. And then, we did recently start a new society called the International Society for Contemplative Research. And so you can go to contemplativeresearch.org, and encourage you to, if you're interested in this kind of work, there's a great community of people there. And I encourage everyone to become a member and to also check out this conference that we're going to have in February in San Diego. There's really great speakers coming. Anil Seth will actually talk about the self. We have a whole invited symposium on set and setting that really relates to mindset. So how the mind can be a contributing factor to your experience in a psychotherapeutic context. And then setting is something we all need to be focused on for improving mental health, for example. Psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is an important new modality of treatment, and Robin Carhart Harris and Rachel Yehuda and Chuck Raison will all be in dialogue with each other, and Sahib Khalsa talking about float tanks. So there's a lot of really cool stuff happening there that's worth checking out.
Awesome.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for being here. That has been the Contemplative Science Podcast, and I hope you enjoyed that half as much as I did.